So the claim I'm going to respond is autonomous vehicles will nearly eliminate traffic in the future. So my opponent's claims were headway between cars can be reduced by autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles will eliminate limits and lights, and his opposing claim to other people would be during weather conditions, autonomous vehicles are not safe, so he was going to try to oppose that they are safe. And autonomous vehicles are basically self-driving cars. So I would challenge my opponent's evidence and reasoning as inefficient grounds to claim his proposition as fact. So his first claim was headway between cars can be reduced by autonomous vehicles, and he mentioned that with his evidence, up to 4,000 vehicles per hour. He claims up to 4,000 vehicles per hour on a highway will be as a result of autonomous vehicles, but he doesn't mention the number before autonomous vehicles. So we can't get an idea of will it double or will it quadruple? He just says that 4,000 vehicles per hour are gonna go by because of these self-driving cars. And then his evidence used to claim that headway between autonomous cars can be reduced and eliminate traffic. I checked his evidence, and the evidence was a theoretical motion graph. So it was just it wasn't an experiment. It was just theoretical. It was just they thought about it. They didn't test them in places where they can just have self-driving cars by themselves. So that's one of the claims I tried to prove wrong. His second claim was that autonomous vehicles will eliminate limits and lights, and he mentions vehicle-to-vehicle communication and he says that the system will create driving infrastructure, but he doesn't explain anything. He just says that it's just gonna create driving infrastructure. He doesn't say what vehicle-to-vehicle communication does. He just mentions the name. And then his only evidence was from the Huffington Post, and he stated that by 2026, it predicted that the road will have a complete vehicle autonomy, but it doesn't. That evidence doesn't tell us that it will eliminate lights and limits. It just says that by 2026, most of the cars are going to be self-driving. And then his last claim was in a response to people thinking that self-driving cars will not be safe in weather conditions, and he didn't really prove that it wouldn't be safe. He actually proved it himself wrong. His evidence used in his argument, in his counter-argument, didn't support his claim at all. It emphasized how weather conditions affect how autonomous vehicles work. So instead of using evidence that describes how the self-driving cars are gonna pass by the weather, he used evidence that said that self-driving cars are not good in weather. And then instead of letting us know how these can overcome weather conditions, he used an ad. He attacked the opposing by saying that humans are also unsafe drivers in weather conditions, rather than defending his own propositions. So yeah, that's it.
All right, Benjamin, you labeled the advocate's points pretty clearly, and there's a good preview of what the supporting structure is going to be. You kind of have a general response to the whole argument, and that is that his proof was insufficient or inefficient in supporting the claim that he's presenting, that he hasn't really provided enough information to reach the conclusion that he is suggesting. You challenge the lack of comparative information on the first point. That, I think, was a pretty reasonable piece of information, that there isn't really any contrasting information, so we don't know how to measure the number of cars traveling on a given road simply by the data that's been provided there. The challenge on the next piece of evidence was that it's from a motion graphic, and not from a study or an experiment, which I think is a reasonable press. But is there something wrong with making an inference from a motion graphic? Why, is it just artificial in this particular situation without any basis? The advocate, I'm not sure that the advocate defended it particularly well. You've got a press on this, and there's not really any other information on this particular point, so it feels a little thin. You clearly transitioned the second point, so that was easy to follow. You challenged the lack of clarity on his argument about vehicle-to-vehicle communication. That's a reasonable press. What I think is missing here is some evidence of your own to suggest that it's unlikely that we're going to have that degree of penetration of vehicle-to-vehicle communication, or the likelihood that all cars at that point, less than 10 years from now, are going to be new vehicles that people are going to be driving that have this sort of technology built into it. The truth of the matter is that the world is full of people driving cars that are older than 10 years old, plenty of them. I got one. Wait, I got two. Wait, I've got three, that all kind of fit into that category. So the notion that there's going to be this huge transition where everybody gets the new technology and therefore all these problems are going to be solved in a short amount of time, I think you need to make an argument on that, and you don't really provide any evidence on that point. So you've got a couple of critiques of his evidence, and maybe an argument on reasoning that doesn't have enough to make the inference that he's talking about. But you need to present some argument on your own. It really feels thin in regard to the refutation part, or I should say the rebuttal part. You've got some refutation issues where you're challenging his grounds and reasoning a little bit, but there's no rebuttal arguments, and I think there are a couple of places where there's some obvious rebuttal arguments that you're missing out on. You label the third point pretty clearly. Again, your argument here is that the evidence is self-defeating because he acknowledges that these vehicles have this kind of difficulty. So instead of it being an answer to the problem, it's an acknowledgement of the problem. And you say his argument that says, but that renders them just the equal to all these other cars. That isn't really a very strong rebuttal to that particular position. You're probably right. So there's not any advantage in bad weather. One of the things that you might argue is that bad weather is typical, for instance, in lots of places, and that's going, in some places it's, here in Southern California, autonomous cars might be great because we always have great weather. But if you live in Portland, where it rains 300 days a year, this could be a problem. If you live in another part of the country where they have inclement weather on a regular basis, it's going to be part of the problem. You could easily show, for instance, what percentage of the population lives where there are regular rainfall, high amounts of snow and precipitation and those sorts of things that might interfere with the communication processes that are going on there, and suggest that the rosy picture really fails to recognize the realities of the environment in which these cars are going to be operating in. That, I think, would have been a pretty obvious response. Okay, thank you.